June 4th, 1942. In exactly 5 minutes, the Pacific War would be over. Not the fighting, that would drag on for 3 more brutal years. But the outcome? Decided. 4 Japanese aircraft carriers, the most powerful naval strike force ever assembled, were about to die. And the man in the dive bomber had no idea he was about to change history. Norman Kleiss, 25 years old, lieutenant junior grade. His bomb sight framed a Japanese carrier, growing larger by the second. Kaga, 1,500 sailors below, armed aircraft on deck, fuel hoses everywhere, anti-aircraft fire exploding around his canopy in black bursts of shrapnel and death. His thumb hovered over the bomb release. 1,000 pounds of high explosive hung beneath his dauntless. Miss, and those sailors live. Hit, and they die, all of them. In fire so intense it would melt steel, 2,500 feet, 10 seconds to impact. His hand was steady. This wasn't courage. This was training, overriding every instinct that screamed, pull up, escape, survive. Then the world cut to black. 6 hours earlier, USS Enterprise, somewhere in the Pacific. The ready room at 4 a.m. was thick with cigarette smoke and the kind of silence that comes before men fly into combat. Some would not return. Everyone knew it. No one said it. Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey stood at the front, pointer in hand, map of the Pacific behind him, and information that would change everything. Gentlemen, the Japanese carrier force has been located 200 miles northwest of Midway. 4 carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu. The room went dead quiet. Those names meant something. These weren't just carriers. This was the Kido Butai, the mobile strike force that had devastated Pearl Harbor 6 months ago. The ships that had terrorized the Pacific from Hawaii to Ceylon. 248 aircraft, the most experienced carrier pilots in the world, men who had been flying combat missions since the invasion of China in 1937. They were considered unstoppable. McCluskey continued, Commander Joseph Rochefort and his team at Station Hypo have been reading the Japanese naval code JN-25 for weeks. Wait, reading their codes? For weeks? We know their entire operation plan. They'll strike Midway at dawn, then wait for our carriers to respond so they can ambush us. He paused. Let that sink in. What they don't realize is that we're already here. The Japanese didn't know it, but they'd been walking into a trap for 3 weeks. Every message they sent, decoded. Every position, known. Every plan, compromised. They thought they were hunting American carriers. They were the prey. But here's the thing about traps. They only work if you survive springing them. 3 American carriers, Enterprise, Hornet, Yorktown, would face 4 Japanese carriers. The Americans had fewer aircraft, less experienced pilots, inferior fighters. The Japanese Zero could outmaneuver anything in the American inventory. Japanese torpedoes worked reliably. American torpedoes had a failure rate approaching 75%. The intelligence was perfect. The odds were terrible. The Japanese will launch their Midway strike at 0430, the briefing officer said. Most of their fighters will be engaged escorting the attack. Their carriers will be recovering and rearming aircraft. This is when we strike. Kleiss looked around the ready room. Some faces he knew well. Others were replacements, fresh from training, facing their first battle. All understood one thing. They'd be operating at extreme fuel range, 175 miles out, 175 miles back, minimal reserve. Find the carriers or run out of fuel trying. Those were the options, and if they found them, the Zeros would be waiting, faster, more maneuverable. Flown by pilots with years of combat experience. Torpedo 8 from Hornet will go in first, McCluskey added quietly. The dive bombers follow. Torpedo 8, flying TBD devastators, obsolete before the war started. Slow, lightly armed, they'd have to fly straight and level to drop torpedoes. Perfect targets. Everyone in that room knew what going in first meant. Someone had to die to create an opening. Torpedo 8 had drawn that assignment. We launch at 0700. By 6 in the morning, Enterprise's flight deck was controlled chaos. Deck crews in colored jerseys performed their pre-dawn ballet. Red shirts loading 1,000-pound bombs, purple shirts connecting fuel lines, brown shirts checking hydraulics. Kleiss walked toward his dauntless Bureau number 639. His rear gunner, John Snowden, was already checking the twin 30-caliber machine guns. "Morning, Mr. Kleiss. Going to be hot today. Morning, Snowden. Keep your eyes peeled." The pre-flight inspection was ritual. Control surfaces moved freely. Bomb rack secure, 1,000 pounds of high explosive hanging beneath the fuselage, painted yellow, stenciled with warnings. Fuel tanks topped off, 230 gallons main, plus two 58-gallon wing tanks. With careful management, maybe 4.5 hours of flight time, just enough to reach the intercept point, search briefly, and return, if everything went perfectly. At 0645, the loudspeaker crackled. "Pilots, start engines." Kleiss pressed the starter. The right cyclone roared to life. He checked gauges, oil pressure rising, engine temperature normal, fuel flow steady. The flight deck officer appeared at his nose, flag raised. The officer watched the deck, ensuring everything was perfect, because one mistake meant death. The flag dropped. Kleiss released brakes. The Dauntless surged forward, accelerating down the deck. The island flashed past. Deck edge approached. At 65 knots, he eased back on the stick. The wheels left the deck. For one terrifying moment, the heavily loaded bomber hung between flying and falling. Then the wings bit air. He climbed. "Good takeoff, Mr. Kleiss." "Thanks. Keep your eyes peeled." It took an hour to form up. By 0806, 33 dive bombers from Enterprise were climbing to 19,000 feet. The planned rendezvous with Hornet's air group never happened. Different course, different timing. McCluskey made a decision. Rather than waste fuel searching for Hornet's planes, he'd proceed alone. They flew northwest in radio silence. Below, the Pacific was featureless blue. Above, empty sky. Ahead, somewhere beyond the horizon, 4 Japanese carriers steamed toward Midway, unaware that their codes were broken, their position known, their doom approaching. Kleiss checked instruments constantly. Fuel gauges, engine temperature, oil pressure. He calculated and recalculated. At 19,000 feet in a dive, he'd have maybe 10 seconds to line up and release. No second chance. The flight stretched on. Minutes became half an hour. Half an hour became an hour. Fuel gauges showed steady consumption. Every mile closer to the intercept point was a mile farther from Enterprise. At 0920, they reached the coordinates where intelligence predicted the Japanese carriers would be. Empty ocean. Nothing but blue water extending to the horizon in every direction. No carriers, no destroyers, no wakes, nothing. Kleiss felt his stomach tighten. Fuel gauge showed over half consumed. Quick calculation, maybe 30 minutes of search time before reaching bingo fuel, the point where returning to Enterprise would require perfect conditions, no combat maneuvering, no missed approaches on landing. After that, they'd be committed. Find the Japanese or ditch in the ocean. Radio silence was oppressive. He couldn't ask if anyone else saw anything, couldn't compare notes. Every pilot was alone with the same terrible mathematics. Fuel draining, ocean empty, time running out. McCluskey faced an impossible decision. Turn back now and everyone returned safely, but the Japanese carriers remain undiscovered, free to attack Midway, possibly to find and destroy the American carriers. Or continue searching, knowing every minute reduced their chances of making it back, knowing some pilots would run out of fuel and ditch, knowing that searching the Pacific for 4 carriers could take hours they didn't have. 30 minutes of fuel left, turn back or die searching. That was the choice. McCluskey chose to search. For 20 agonizing minutes, they flew over empty ocean. Fuel gauges crept toward red, every pilot doing mental math. Distance to target, distance back to Enterprise, fuel consumption rate, wind speed. The numbers didn't look good. Kleiss checked his gauge again. He was approaching the point where returning would require everything to go perfectly. No combat, no searching for the carrier, no wave-off on landing approach. After that point, he'd be committed. Attack whatever they found, or ditch in the Pacific and hope for rescue. Around him, other Dauntlesses flew in formation, each pilot alone with the same calculations, the same fear, the same determination. They'd come this far. The Japanese carriers were out here somewhere. Intelligence had been perfect so far. The codes were broken. The intercept point should have been right. So where were they? Then, at 09:55, McCluskey waggled to his wings. The signal meant he'd seen something. Kleiss looked down, a white wake cutting through the blue ocean, a lone Japanese destroyer racing northeast at high speed. McCluskey made a gambler's bet. The destroyer was heading somewhere, probably toward the main fleet. He turned to follow. This was the decision that would change history. One destroyer, one wake, one intuition. McCluskey had no confirmation, no intelligence, just a hunch that this ship knew where the carriers were. If he was wrong, 33 dive bombers would run out of fuel and ditch in the Pacific. Dozens of pilots and gunners would die. The Japanese carriers would escape. Midway would fall. The Pacific War would take a very different path, if he was right. For 20 more minutes, they followed that wake. Fuel gauges bounced on empty. Radio channels stayed silent. But Kleiss knew every pilot was thinking the same thing. Turn back now, while there's still time. While the engines will still make it to Enterprise. But no one broke formation. They'd come this far on broken codes and intelligence reports. Now, they'd follow one wake on nothing but faith. Kleiss's fuel gauge was deep in the red. He leaned the mixture until the engine ran rough, trading engine health for a few more minutes of flight time. The right cyclone sputtered, caught, ran rough but kept running. Around him, other Dauntlesses were having the same problems. Some trailed slight wisps of smoke from engines running too lean. Others visibly struggled to maintain formation. This was it. Minutes left at most. Then they'd start falling from the sky. Then, at 10:20, the Pacific Ocean gave up its secret. 4 carriers appeared below like toys on blue carpet. 2 groups, surrounded by destroyers and cruisers. White wakes showed they were maneuvering. Aircraft sat on flight decks, and incredibly, impossibly, there were no Zero fighters at 19,000 feet. All the Zeros were down low, and Kleiss was about to find out why. But first, someone had to die to make this moment possible. 15 miles away, at wavetop altitude, Torpedo Squadron 8 was being slaughtered. Lieutenant Commander John Waldron led 15 TBD Devastators in a straight line toward the Japanese carriers. No fighter escort, no support. Flying obsolete aircraft that should never have been in combat. The TBD's top speed was barely 100 knots. Slower than a Zero could fly backwards, and they had to fly straight and level to drop their torpedoes. For 60 seconds, perfect targets. The Zeros dove on them like hawks on sparrows. 20-millimeter cannon fire tore through thin armor. Devastators exploded, cartwheeled into the ocean, broke apart. Waldron's plane was hit first. Direct hit to the cockpit. The aircraft exploded midair. One by one, all 15 Devastators were shot down. Not one torpedo hit. Every aircraft destroyed. 29 of 30 men killed in 12 minutes of systematic annihilation. Only Ensign George Gay survived. His Devastator was hit, his gunner killed, his plane shredded. He managed to ditch, climbed onto his seat cushion, and watched from the water as the rest of his squadron died. He watched Devastators explode, watched them cartwheel into the ocean, watched men trapped in sinking aircraft, pounding on canopies that wouldn't open, drowning while he floated 50 yards away, helpless. Then he watched Zeros return to the carriers, victorious. Watched them land. Watched pilots climb from cockpits, celebrating. They'd saved the Kido Butai from American torpedo attack. They'd performed exactly as trained. And in doing so, they'd left the sky at 19,000 feet, completely empty. This is McCluskey. Scouting 6, take the left carrier. Bombing 6, the right carrier. But in the confusion and excitement, both squadrons began diving on the same carrier. Kaga. Kleiss pushed forward on the stick. The nose dropped. The altimeter started to unwind. His dive had begun. And George Gay, floating in the water, looked up, saw black dots high in the sky, watched them grow into dive bombers, watched them tip over and plunge toward the carriers, watched his squadron mate's sacrifice become meaningful. Acceleration crushed Kleiss back into his seat. The Dauntless pitched into a 70-degree dive, surrendering to gravity, becoming a guided missile with a man strapped inside. The altimeter unwound, 18,000 feet, 15,000, 12,000. Kaga expanded from toy to ship to universe. Her flight deck was frozen chaos. Yellow-shirted handlers pushing aircraft, red fuel hoses snaking everywhere, bombs on carts, torpedoes being loaded. The ship was caught at the worst possible moment. The transition between missions, armed aircraft on deck, fuel everywhere, crew exposed, no fighters overhead. Black puffs of anti-aircraft fire burst around him. The Japanese gunners had spotted the dive bombers late, but were firing now, desperate, filling the sky with exploding shells. Shrapnel pinged off his wings, his canopy. The sound was muted by the scream of wind and engine. Kleiss held his course, 10,000 feet. He could see individual aircraft now, Type 99 dive bombers, Zero fighters, Nakajima torpedo bombers, all being refueled and rearmed. Aviation gasoline vapor hung heavy in the air. One spark would turn the carrier into an inferno. Kleiss was about to provide that spark. 8,000 feet. Lieutenant Earl Gallagher released first. His bomb fell, tumbled, stabilized. Struck near Kaga's island superstructure. The explosion was enormous. A pillar of fire erupted, carrying aircraft fragments, deck pieces, human bodies into the air like rag dolls. The blast wave rolled across the carrier. Aviation gasoline ignited, spread in burning rivers. More bombs fell. Second hit aft, third forward, 2,500 feet. Kleiss's release point. The carrier filled his bomb site completely. He could see men running, some toward our damage control stations, others away from spreading fire. He could see a Zero being pushed toward the deck edge, crew desperately trying to clear it before flames reached its fuel tanks. He pressed the release. The Dauntless lurched upward. Kleiss pulled back on the stick immediately. 9 Gs crushed him into his seat. Vision tunneled. Blood drained from his brain. The world went gray. The Dauntless groaned, every rivet strained, wings flexed dangerously, then level, racing away at wavetop altitude, water a blur beneath his wheels. "Direct hit," Snowden shouted. "Forward elevator." Kleiss banked left. His bomb had struck Kaga's forward flight deck elevator, punched through, detonated in the hangar below. The elevator, tons of steel weighing as much as a locomotive, was blown completely off the ship. It spun through the air like a playing card before crashing into the ocean hundreds of yards away. Kaga was dying. Fire consumed her stem to stern. Flight deck buckling, aircraft exploding, torpedoes cooking off, men jumping into burning oil-covered water, choosing drowning over fire. But Kaga was only one carrier. At exactly the same moment, Lieutenant Richard Best pulled out of his dive early, both squadrons attacking the same target, waste of bombs. In combat, hesitation kills. Best made a split-second decision. He and 2 wingmen broke away, headed for a different carrier, Akagi, Admiral Nagumo's flagship. Best's approach was perfect. He dove while anti-aircraft fire concentrated on the main Kaga attack. His bomb sight centered on Akagi's flight deck amidships. Release. His 1,000-pound bomb struck dead center, punched through the flight deck, penetrated into the hangar before detonating. The explosion occurred among 18 fully fueled Type 99 dive bombers armed with bombs. The hangar became a crematorium. Fire flashed through at explosive speed, consumed oxygen, incinerated crew, detonated bombs and torpedoes in chain reaction. Blast pressure ruptured hull plates. Flames shot up through elevator openings. The flight deck became a bonfire. On Akagi's bridge, Commander Mitsuo Fuchida, the man who led the Pearl Harbor attack, watched his world end. He'd been standing there watching Zero slaughter American torpedo bombers, victorious, confident. Then he heard someone shout, looked up, saw black dots, confusion. Where had they come from? Where were the Zeros? Then Best's bomb struck. The explosion came from within. Fire erupted through both elevator shafts. The flight deck, loaded with armed and fueled aircraft, waiting to launch, exploded. Fuchida tried to reach the flight deck. Smoke filled the passageways. Fire blocked his path. He collapsed. Was dragged to safety by crew who should have been saving themselves. Admiral Nagumo stood on the bridge as his flagship died. 55 years old, commander of the Pearl Harbor attack, leader of the Kido Butai, one of Japan's finest admirals. His face was expressionless. He seemed to have aged years in minutes. Staff officers argued around him. Transfer to a destroyer, continue the battle, or go down with Akagi. Accept responsibility through death. Radio reports came in, each one worse than the last. Kaga is burning, multiple bomb hits, uncontrollable fires. Soryu reports hit, multiple bombs, fires spreading, 3 carriers in 5 minutes, because at precisely 10:22, while Enterprise and Hornet bombers were attacking Kaga and Akagi, dive bombers from Yorktown arrived and attacked Soryu. Lieutenant Commander Maxwell Leslie led Bombing Squadron 3 in textbook dives. They'd launched late, flown a different course, arrived at the same moment purely by coincidence. 3,000-pound bombs hit Soryu within 30 seconds. The carrier exploded. A pillar of fire rose 1,000 feet, visible for 50 miles. Soryu's hull ripped open. She listed immediately. Fires consumed her superstructure. Captain Ryusaku Yanagimoto gave the order to abandon ship at 10:45. Crew poured onto the tilting flight deck, jumped into the water. Some made it to life rafts. Many drowned. Yanagimoto remained on the bridge. When officers came to escort him, he refused. He would go down with his ship. They argued. He ordered them to leave. The last they saw him, he was standing at attention, facing the Emperor's portrait, singing the national anthem as Soryu rolled over beneath him. At 11:13, Soryu capsized completely. Her hull gleamed in the sunlight for a moment. Then she slipped beneath the Pacific, carrying Yanagimoto and over 700 crew to the bottom 3 miles down. 20 minutes. Operational to tomb. No ship could absorb that damage. No damage control could fight fires that fierce. No crew could prevent physics from claiming its due. 3 carriers destroyed in 5 minutes. The Kido Butai, the elite strike force that had terrorized the Pacific for 6 months, had ceased to exist. But the cost of that victory was still being counted. Zeros at 3 o'clock high. Kleiss saw them. 2 fighters diving, their distinctive wing profiles unmistakable. The Zero was faster, more maneuverable, more heavily armed. In a dogfight, the Dauntless had no chance. He pushed forward. The Dauntless nosed down, 260 miles per hour, 270, 280. The airframe shook, wings flexed, but they held. Behind him, Snowden's guns chattered, firing at the pursuing Zeros. Range was long, deflection difficult, but he kept firing. Tracers whipped past Kleiss's canopy. The Zeros were firing. 20-millimeter cannons. One hit would be catastrophic. Sever a control cable, puncture a fuel tank, shatter the engine. Then Snowden's guns went silent. "Snowden, you okay?" "Hit, but okay. Got one." A Zero trailed smoke, spun toward the ocean. Augured in, white splash. Gone. But more Zeros were coming, and Kleiss's fuel gauge was pegged on empty. The flight back was hell. Engine sputtering, fuel gone. Other Dauntlesses struggling, some trailing smoke, others running dry. Radio channels filled with desperate calls. Engine cutting out, going in, ditching, mark position. Enterprise, emergency fuel. 2 Dauntlesses ahead ran out of fuel. Kleiss watched them nose toward water. One pilot managed a controlled ditching. The aircraft settled, skipped once, settled. Pilot and gunner climbed onto the wing, deployed life raft, waited for rescue that might come in hours or never. The second pilot wasn't as lucky. Hit wrong angle, nose dug in. The Devastator flipped, broke apart. No survivors, just debris and oil. Kleiss's engine coughed, missed, caught, ran rough. Then Enterprise appeared on the horizon. Deck turned into wind, ready for recovery. Enterprise, 6 Baker 2, emergency fuel, your number 3. Number 3, 2 aircraft ahead, each taking precious seconds. Seconds he didn't have. His engine quit, propeller windmilling. No power, just air resistance. The Dauntless became a glider, trading altitude for airspeed, one chance to land or he'd ditch alongside. Too high. The landing signal officer waved him off. Go around. But there was no going around. No engine, no fuel, one chance. Kleiss pushed the nose down, trading altitude for speed. Deck rushed up, fast, steep. Edge of control. Wheels hit, bounced. Airborne again. Wheels hit again. Tail hook caught the wire. The deceleration was brutal. 90 knots to 0 in 2 seconds. Deck crew swarmed before the propeller stopped. Get us out. Wounded. They pulled Snowden from the rear, hit in shoulder and leg, blood-soaked flight suit. But conscious. Managed a weak smile. He'd survive. Kleiss's plane had over 40 holes. Bullet holes. Shrapnel tears. One cannon shell had passed through the vertical stabilizer, missing rudder cables by inches. How she'd held together, he'd never know. But she had. She'd brought him home. The ready room was filling with returning pilots. They stripped off flight gear, grabbed coffee, reported to intelligence officers. The mood was strange. Not celebration, not quite shock. Something between. They'd struck a blow beyond imagination. But the cost was becoming apparent. Of 14 torpedo bombers from Torpedo 6, only 4 returned. 10 crews gone. The news from Hornet was worse. Torpedo 8 completely annihilated. 15 aircraft launched. 15 shot down. 29 of 30 men killed. Only George Gay survived. Shot down, wounded, floating for 30 hours hiding under a seat cushion while Japanese ships passed overhead, watching the entire battle from the water, watching his squadron mates die. All of them. Lieutenant Commander John Waldron's last transmission was brief. We will go in. We will not turn back. Good luck. Every aircraft in his squadron was destroyed. Not one torpedo hit, but their sacrifice pulled Zeros down to wave top altitude, left the sky clear at 19,000 feet when the dive bombers arrived. Torpedo 8 bought victory with their lives, knowingly, willingly. That afternoon, Enterprise launched again. Hiryu, the 4th carrier, remained operational. Dangerous. She'd launched strikes that crippled Yorktown. She could launch again. 24 dive bombers found Hiryu at 1700 hours, put 4,000-pound bombs into her. She burned through the night before scuttling at dawn. The last of the Kido Butai slipped beneath the Pacific. The Battle of Midway was over. The strategic implications were just beginning. To understand what died at Midway requires seeing those 5 minutes from the deck of a Japanese carrier, from the perspective of men who believed they were invincible and discovered they were mortal. Lieutenant Makoto Okamoto was 23 years old. He'd joined the Imperial Japanese Navy at 18, had flown missions since the invasion of China, had participated in the Pearl Harbor attack. He was pushing a Zero fighter across Kaga's flight deck when someone shouted. He looked up, saw black dots high in the sky. His mind couldn't process what they were immediately. Too high, too sudden. Then the dots grew, became aircraft, became dive bombers plunging downward at impossible angles. His last thought was confusion. Where had they come from? Where were the Zeros? Why had no one sounded? Earl Gallagher's bomb struck. Akimoto ceased to exist. The explosion was beyond comprehension. The 1,000-pound bomb penetrated the flight deck and detonated among fueled aircraft in the hangar. Aviation gasoline ignited instantly. The fireball consumed everything within 50 feet. Then the bombs started cooking off. Then the torpedoes. Akimoto and 37 other crew members in that section were incinerated before they could process what was happening. Others were blown overboard by blast pressure. The lucky ones died before hitting the water. The unlucky ones lived long enough to burn. More bombs fell. Kaga's flight deck buckled. Steel melted. Aircraft exploded. The ship shuddered with internal detonations. Captain Jisaku Okada stood on Kaga's bridge as his ship died. He'd commanded her since November 1941, led her through Pearl Harbor, the Indian Ocean, the Java Sea. She was his responsibility. his life. Now he watched her burn, knowing what was happening in those hangars could not be stopped. The fire spread faster than damage control could fight them. Aviation gasoline burned in rivers. Ventilation systems spread smoke to undamaged compartments. Bulkheads failed. At 10:40, Okada gave the order he never thought he'd give. Abandon ship. Crew began jumping, some into water, others into burning oil that had leaked from ruptured tanks. They thrashed, screamed, drowned, or burned. Destroyers attempted rescue, but the chaos was overwhelming. Okada remained on the bridge. Japanese naval tradition was absolute. A captain does not leave while men still live on his ship. He watched the fires consume everything, watched men die, watched 800 crew members, many trapped below decks, burn or drown. Kaga was finally scuttled by torpedoes at 1700 hours. She sank slowly, settling by the bow, stern rising, before sliding beneath the Pacific. Captain Okada went down with her. He was 47 years old. Simultaneously on Akagi, Commander Mitsuo Fuchida, architect of the Pearl Harbor attack, watched from the bridge as Dick Best's bomb struck amidships. The explosion came from within. The hangar erupted. Fire shot upward through both elevator shafts. The flight deck had been loaded with 18 Type 99 dive bombers, fully armed and fueled, waiting to launch against the American carriers. Now they exploded in sequence like a string of firecrackers. Each explosion triggered the next. The entire deck became an inferno. Admiral Chuichi Nagumo stood frozen. He was 55 years old, commander of the Kido Butai, leader of the most successful carrier operations in naval history. And in 5 minutes, he was watching that force die. Staff officers around him were shouting, "Transfer to Nagara. Continue the battle. Hiryu is still operational. You must command." Nagumo said nothing. His face had gone slack, expressionless. He'd aged a decade in minutes. The radio reports kept coming. Kaga reports uncontrollable fires, abandoning ship. Soryu hit, capsizing. Captain Yanagimoto refusing evacuation. 3 carriers mortally wounded. In the time it took to drink a cup of tea. Finally, Nagumo's chief of staff made the decision for him. They evacuated to the cruiser Nagara at 10:46. Nagumo climbed down a rope from Akagi's bridge to a boat waiting below. Some would call it cowardice. Others understood it as necessity. The battle continued even if Akagi did not. But Nagumo never recovered, would be relegated to shore commands, would end up commanding the defense of Saipan 2 years later. When American forces overran the island in July 1944, Nagumo chose death over capture. He and his chief of staff shot themselves in a cave while Marines closed in. He carried Midway's failure for 2 years before choosing to end it. On Soryu, Captain Ryusaku Yanagimoto made a different choice. When the bombs hit, 3 within 30 seconds, he knew immediately his ship was doomed. Soryu had been designed for speed over armor. Her thin deck plating couldn't stop the 1,000-pound bombs. Her fire suppression systems were overwhelmed instantly. The list increased. 10 degrees, 15, 20. At that angle, firefighting became impossible. Equipment slid, men lost footing, abandoned ship. Crew poured onto the tilting deck, jumped into the water. Some made it to life rafts. Many were pulled down by suction as the carrier rolled. Officers came to escort Yanagimoto to safety. He refused, ordered them to leave. When they hesitated, he drew his sword and ordered them off his bridge. The last they saw him, he was standing at attention, sword in hand, facing a portrait of Emperor Hirohito, singing Kimigayo, the national anthem, as his ship capsized beneath him. At 11:13, Soryu rolled completely. Her hull showed bottom paint never meant to see sunlight. Then she slipped under, taking Yanagimoto and 717 men with her. 23 minutes from hit to sinking, no amount of training or courage could prevent it. Physics doesn't care about bravery. But here's what Japan lost that day beyond the ships. Over 100 veteran carrier pilots died, men who'd been flying since China, who understood carrier operations in ways that couldn't be taught. Who could land on a pitching deck in darkness? Who could coordinate multi-carrier strikes? All gone in 5 minutes. Japan's pilot training program could replace them numerically. 100 new pilots per year, but it would take a year, and during that year, combat would continue. More pilots would be lost. The deficit would grow. America's program was already producing 4,000 pilots per year. Not as skilled initially, but adequate, and there would be enough of them to absorb losses and keep fighting. The mathematics were inexorable. Japan would lose pilots faster than training could replace them. America would train pilots faster than combat could eliminate them. Over time, Japanese quality would decline, American quality would improve. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto understood this immediately. Standing on battleship Yamato 300 miles behind the carriers, he received the reports throughout the day. Each message was a dagger. Akagi burning, Kaga sinking, Soryu capsized, Hiryu damaged. By evening, when Hiryu's fate was confirmed, Yamamoto knew the Kido Butai was finished. He'd warned before the war that Japan could run wild for 6 months to a year. After that, he had no confidence. Midway occurred exactly 6 months after Pearl Harbor. His prediction was proving accurate. That night, Yamamoto ordered retreat. No invasion of Midway, no decisive battle, just retreat and try to comprehend what had happened. He confided to his chief of staff, "I fear all we have done is awaken a sleeping giant and fill him with terrible resolve." Yamamoto would be killed in April 1943. American P-38 fighters, guided by decoded Japanese messages, intercepted his transport plane over Bougainville and shot it down. He died knowing Japan couldn't win, knowing the war he'd helped start would consume his country, but that was still 10 months away. Tonight, the Imperial Japanese Navy was trying to process a defeat beyond comprehension. 4 carriers sunk, 3,000 men dead. The elite strike force that had dominated the Pacific for 6 months, destroyed in 5 minutes. And in Tokyo, the truth was immediately classified. The Imperial Japanese Navy headquarters issued communiques claiming victory. American carriers sunk, Midway neutralized, Japanese forces withdrawing as planned. The truth was buried. Casualty lists were altered, death dates scattered across weeks to hide the pattern. Families were told their sons died heroically in various operations. Wounded survivors were isolated, forbidden to speak. But in the villages where the dead had lived, truth couldn't be completely hidden. Too many notifications arriving within days. Too many young men from naval units disappearing simultaneously. In Nagano Prefecture, the Suzuki family received notification in August. Their second son, Seaman First Class Hiroshi Suzuki, age 19, had been killed in action. No details, no location, just notification and condolences. Hiroshi's last letter had been written June 3rd, never delivered, found in his locker after Kaga sank. In it, he told his mother not to worry. They were about to strike a blow that would end the war. He'd be home soon. Asked about his younger sister's schooling, mentioned he'd saved money to send home. On June 4th at 10:20, Hiroshi was in Kaga's forward hangar when Earl Gallagher's bomb detonated 20 feet above him. He died instantly, never knew what hit him. His body was never recovered, rests somewhere in Kaga's wreckage 3 miles down. The Suzuki family erected a small shrine, placed his photograph there, burned incense, prayed, and wondered for the rest of their lives what really happened. In Ohio, Helen Morrison received a telegram in late June. Her husband, aviation machinist's mate. Second Class William Morrison, age 23, had been killed in action serving with Torpedo 8. William and Helen had been married 2 years. She'd given birth to their daughter while Hornet was at sea. 3 months old, dark hair. William had never met her, carried her photograph in his flight suit pocket. On June 4th at 10:10, William's aircraft was hit by 0 cannon fire. The TBD exploded mid-air. William and pilot John Waldron were killed instantly. No bodies recovered, no graves, just telegrams and grief. Helen would remarry in 1945, would raise her daughter, would live until 1982. But part of her died in June 1942 with a husband she'd known for 2 years and would mourn for 40. These were the hidden costs, not just 3,000 dead, but the families left behind, futures erased, children growing up without fathers, parents outliving their children. Meanwhile, Yorktown refused to die quickly. 3 bombs at noon had started fires. 2 torpedoes at 14:30 had flooded engine rooms. Captain Buckmaster ordered abandon ship, convinced she was doomed. But Yorktown drifted through the night, listing 23 degrees, fires out, still afloat. Salvage teams returned June 5th, connected tow lines, stabilized the list, began pumping. For 24 hours, it seemed she might be saved. Then, on June 6th, Japanese submarine Weiss 168 penetrated the destroyer screen, fired 4 torpedoes. 3 hit Yorktown, 1 hit destroyer Hamon alongside. Hamon broke in half, sank in 4 minutes. Her depth charges detonated as she went down, killing men who jumped into the water. Yorktown finally gave up, sank at 0500 June 7th. The salvage teams had worked 48 hours, had been hours from beginning the tow to Pearl Harbor. 1 submarine ended it. The ready room on Enterprise the days after was strange, celebration mixed with loss, empty chairs where pilots had sat, lockers to be cleared, personal effects packaged for families, letters half-written that would never be finished. McCluskey attended the memorial service June 6th. Enterprise's chaplain read names. Gallagher spoke about the men who hadn't returned, mentioned courage, skill, sacrifice, didn't mention how they died because those details were too raw. The service ended with taps. The notes drifted across the flight deck and disappeared into the Pacific wind. Then everyone returned to duty. Because Guadalcanal was coming, the Solomons, 3 more years of war. For George Gay, the sole survivor of Torpedo 8, June 4th became the day he'd spend the rest of his life trying to understand. Why him? Why did he survive when 29 others died? He'd watched from the water, seen every devastator shot down, Waldron's plane exploding, aircraft cartwheeling into the ocean, men trapped in sinking planes. Then, 30 hours floating, hiding under his seat cushion when Japanese ships passed, sunburned, dehydrated, thinking every moment he'd be captured or killed. Rescued by PBY on June 5th, pulled from the water more dead than alive, he'd live until 1994, become a TWA pilot, write books, speak at Navy events, ensure Torpedo 8's sacrifice was remembered. But he never escaped that day, never stopped seeing his squadron mates die, never found a satisfactory answer to why he lived when they didn't. When he died in 1994, his family scattered his ashes at sea near where Torpedo 8 had been destroyed. 52 years later, he rejoined them. Perhaps the burden finally lifted. Dick Best, who'd put his bomb through Akagi's heart with perfect precision, paid a different price. During the dive, he'd breathed caustic soda from a defective oxygen system. It permanently damaged his lungs. He was medically retired in 1944 at 28. Could never fly again, lived with respiratory problems for 57 years. He rarely spoke about Midway. When pressed, he'd describe the dive with technical precision, but avoid discussing what it meant to kill hundreds of men with 1 bomb. He'd done his duty. The bomb hit. The carrier sank. Everything else was irrelevant. He lived until 2001, was often called the man who won Midway. Hated the title. Midway was won by hundreds of men making coordinated attacks under impossible circumstances. Not 1 bomb on 1 carrier. But narrative demands heroes. 3,057 Japanese died, 362 Americans. But statistics abstract away individual tragedies. Each number was a human being, each death a tragedy. Each family left behind carried grief that never fully healed. The price of Midway was measured in empty chairs at family tables, children who grew up without fathers, parents who buried empty coffins, survivors who carried guilt and memory for decades, and 4 carriers resting 3 miles down in water so deep that no light reaches them, where no recovery is possible, where they'll remain until corrosion returns them to the ocean. But here's what nobody understood at the time. Midway wasn't just a tactical defeat for Japan, it was a death sentence delivered in installments. The carriers could be replaced. Slowly. Japan still had Shokaku and Zuikaku undergoing repairs, would build Taiho, convert Shinano from a battleship hull, commission smaller carriers. But the pilots? The institutional knowledge? The men who understood carrier warfare in their bones? Those couldn't be replaced. And that's where Japan's defeat became mathematical, inevitable, brutal. Japan's training program, 100 carrier pilots per year, rigorous, selective, excellent quality, but only 100. America's program, scaling to 4,000 per year, not as skilled initially, but adequate. And there would be enough of them. At Midway, Japan lost over 100 veteran pilots. The program could replace them numerically in a year. But during that year, combat continued. Guadalcanal started in August. The meat grinder began. Guadalcanal became Midway in slow motion. Instead of losing 4 carriers in one day, Japan lost them over 6 months. Carrier aircraft flew from Rabaul to support ground operations, encountered American fighters based on Henderson Field, fought, died. Experienced pilots were lost at rates training couldn't match. By February 1943, when Japan evacuated Guadalcanal, the institutional knowledge that survived Midway was gone. The men who'd flown since China, who could land on pitching decks in darkness, who understood carrier tactics intimately, nearly all were dead. Their replacements were brave, motivated, but inexperienced. Maybe 100 hours flight time versus 500 plus for pre-war pilots. They didn't have the instincts, made mistakes veterans wouldn't have made. And they died quickly, often on their first or second missions. The Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944 illustrated this devastation. Japan committed 9 carriers with over 400 aircraft. America brought 15 carriers with over 900 aircraft. The battle became known as the Great Marianas. Turkey shoot. Japanese pilots, poorly trained and inexperienced, flew into American fighter screens and were slaughtered. Over 300 aircraft shot down in one afternoon. 3 carriers sunk. American losses? 29 aircraft. Most pilots rescued. This was Midway's legacy. The loss of irreplaceable experience. The inability to train replacements fast enough. The slow degradation until Japanese carrier aviation became ineffective. Admiral Nagumo never recovered. Shore commands. Then Saipan defense in July 1944. When American forces overran the island, he committed suicide. Shot himself in a cave while Marines closed in. Carried Midway's failure for 2 years before ending it. Commander Fuchida survived. Grounded after Midway. His ankles never healed. Continued in staff positions. Was scheduled to be in Hiroshima for a conference. Left the day before the atomic bomb dropped. Survived by chance. After the war, he became a Christian missionary. Traveled to America, met Pearl Harbor survivors, preached reconciliation, wrote extensively about the Pacific War, often returning to Midway, called it the battle that lost the war in 5 minutes, maintained that if Nagumo had launched 30 minutes earlier, Japan might have won. But history deals in what happened. Nagumo hesitated. The dive bombers arrived at the perfect moment. 4 carriers sank. Japan's defeat became inevitable. By 1943, the pattern was clear. American forces advanced island by island. Each operation followed the same script. Carrier air cover, battleship bombardment, Marines land, Japanese garrison fights to the death. Island becomes American base for the next operation. The Japanese Navy couldn't stop this, couldn't concentrate enough carriers, couldn't win surface engagements. American radar and night fighting capabilities had become superior, couldn't prevent the advance. Admiral Yamamoto was killed April 1943. P-38S, guided by decoded messages, shot down his transport. Some argue his death was short-sighted. He understood Japan couldn't win, might have negotiated peace. Others maintain he was killed because he was effective, understood American capabilities, adapted tactics accordingly. Either way, His death removed the one leader who fully understood the strategic situation. His successors were competent, but lacked his insight. They continued fighting with decreasing effectiveness. By October 1944, at the Battle of Leyte Gulf, Japan had no trained carrier pilots left. The carriers Zuikaku, Chirose, Chiyoda, and Zuiho sailed with nearly empty flight decks, serving as bait to draw American carriers away. The plan failed. All four were sunk. Zuikaku, the last Pearl Harbor veteran, went down with minimal resistance. The Kidobutai, which began the war with 6 carriers and the world's best naval aviators, ceased to exist. Its final operation was sailing empty carriers as decoys because there were no pilots to fly from them. This was Midway's ultimate consequence, not just 4 carriers sunk in June 1942, but the complete destruction of Japanese carrier aviation. The institutional knowledge died at Midway. The experienced pilots died at Guadalcanal. The replacements died in Philippine Sea. By late 1944, nothing remained. Norman Kleiss flew 85 combat missions, watched as American carrier aviation evolved, new aircraft, better tactics, superior technology. Also watched as Japanese opposition weakened. Early battles were desperate struggles. Later battles were one-sided. By 1944, Japanese pilots were so poorly trained they often couldn't hit targets or evade fighters. Many shot down on first missions. Kleiss felt no satisfaction in this. He'd respected the Japanese pilots he'd faced in 1942. Skilled, brave, dangerous. Their degradation was necessary, but sad. War had reduced them from elite aviators to barely trained sacrifices. The disparity by war's end was staggering. America commissioned over 100 carriers. Japan built perhaps 20, most sunk before contributing significantly. America trained tens of thousands of pilots. Japan trained thousands, but lost them faster than they could be replaced. The mathematics Yamamoto understood in 1941 had played out exactly as he feared. America's industrial capacity overwhelmed Japan's initial advantages. Midway accelerated it. But even without Midway, the outcome was likely inevitable. What Midway did was make the timeline clear. After June 1942, informed observers understood Japan couldn't win. The only questions were how long and what the final cost would be. The answers were 3 more years and hundreds of thousands more deaths. All set in motion by 5 minutes when dive bombers caught carriers with armed aircraft on deck. In 2019, research vessel Petrel was searching the Pacific floor using advanced sonar. They were looking for something that had rested undisturbed for 77 years, something that was both a shipwreck and a grave. At coordinates near Midway, in water exceeding 17,000 feet deep, they found it. Kaga. The images were haunting. She sits upright on the bottom, hull largely intact, but flight deck destroyed. The explosions and fires that killed her are still visible in twisted steel and collapsed structures. Near her lies Akagi, showing massive fire damage. These are war graves, tombs of over 1,500 men who died June 4th, 1942. Japanese officials requested the wrecks not be disturbed. The request was honored. The ships were documented, but left untouched. At 17,000 feet, the pressure is over 7,000 pounds per square inch. The water is near freezing. No light penetrates. Time moves differently there, measured in the slow corrosion of steel, the gradual transformation of human artifacts back into elements. Soryu has not been located. She sank in deep water where precise coordinates weren't recorded. She rests somewhere, with Captain Yanagimoto still aboard, singing the national anthem as his ship rolled over. Hiryu hasn't been positively identified either. She drifted for hours burning before being scuttled. The destroyers that sank her didn't record exact positions. She lies somewhere with Captain Kaku and Admiral Yamaguchi still lashed to her bridge, having chosen death over dishonor. Norman Kleiss lived to be 100 years old, died in 2016, 74 years after the dive that defined his life. In those decades he married, raised a family, retired as a Navy captain, attended reunions, spoke at commemorations, became one of the last living links to Midway. But he never fully left that dive, never stopped seeing Kaga's deck in his bomb sight. In interviews during his final years, he described technical details with precision. But when asked about the emotional experience, he'd pause. Choose words carefully. Say that war was young men killing each other, and that necessity didn't make it less tragic. He didn't consider himself a hero. The real heroes, he'd say, were the torpedo crews who flew to certain death, the mechanics who kept planes flying, the corpsmen who saved lives. He'd just done his job, survived through skill, training, and luck. Nothing heroic about that. Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey retired as Rear Admiral in 1956. His decision to follow that destroyer, to continue past the intercept point when fuel was critical, that decision changed history. But McCluskey never sought recognition, never wrote memoirs. When asked about Midway, he'd shrug. The destroyer was heading somewhere. Following it was obvious. That this obvious choice altered the Pacific War seemed unremarkable to him. He died in 1976 at 69, his pivotal role largely forgotten by the general public, known mainly to naval historians. He'd saved possibly the entire Pacific campaign with one decision and remained mostly unknown for it. Perhaps that's appropriate. Midway was won by many such decisions. Rochefort breaking JN-25, Nimitz trusting that intelligence, Waldron leading Torpedo 8 straight in, best breaking away to hit Akagi instead. Dozens of choices made in moments of uncertainty, each contributing to the outcome. Want to know how thin the margins were? Consider the alternate histories. What if McCluskey had turned back at the empty intercept point? The dive bombers returned to Enterprise. Japanese carriers complete arming their aircraft. Launch. Find the American carriers. Attack them by surprise. Japan wins at Midway. Captures the island. Controls the Central Pacific. The war's trajectory changes completely. What if Nagumo had launched 30 minutes earlier? His aircraft would be armed wrong, high-explosive bombs instead of armor-piercing. But they'd be airborne when American dive bombers arrived. Carriers wouldn't be caught with armed aircraft on deck. Fires wouldn't spread uncontrollably. Some carriers might survive. Japan might win. What if American torpedoes had worked? Torpedo 8's weapons often failed even when they hit. If they'd functioned, some might have struck carriers. The damage would have been different. The battle's rhythm changes. Small differences, individual decisions, moments of chance, all contributing to outcomes that seem inevitable in retrospect, but were contingent in the moment. But history deals in what was. McCluskey didn't turn back. Nagumo didn't launch early. The torpedoes didn't work. The dive bombers arrived at the perfect moment. 4 carriers were caught vulnerable. They were destroyed. Japan's offensive capabilities shattered. The war's outcome determined. So what's the lesson? What does Midway teach us 79 years later? That ordinary people facing extraordinary circumstances can rise to meet them. That democracy produces warriors as brave as any totalitarian system. That free men fighting for homes and families are among the most powerful forces on Earth. Commander Rochefort and his codebreakers worked in a basement, breaking codes through brilliance and intuition. They weren't warriors traditionally, but their intelligence won the battle as surely as bombs. Admiral Nimitz gambled his entire carrier force on intelligence that might have been wrong, risked Hawaii itself, made a decision requiring courage or madness, turned out correct. John Waldron led Torpedo 8, knowing his squadron would be slaughtered. Understanding their sacrifice was necessary to create an opening. Wade McCluskey followed a destroyer past the point where prudence dictated turning back. Bet his pilots' lives on intuition, Richard Best broke away from certain target to attack different carrier, trusted instinct in chaos. Norman Kleiss held his dive through anti-aircraft fire, placed his bomb precisely, pulled out at the last moment, flew home on fumes. Each decision was individual, each made under uncertainty and stress. Each could have gone wrong. Together, they produced victory. That's what Midway teaches. Wars aren't won by superior numbers or better equipment, though those help. Wars are won by people who adapt, who seize opportunities, who sustain losses and continue, who make right decisions at critical moments, even when those decisions aren't obvious. Japan had better fighters, more experienced pilots, superior torpedoes, institutional knowledge from years of operations, but they lacked broken codes, lacked radar, lacked damage control that made American ships survivable, lacked industrial might that replaced losses tenfold. Most importantly, lacked leaders who understood calculated risks were necessary. Nagumo hesitated when boldness was required. McCluskey pushed forward when caution was advised. That difference determined the outcome. Today's generation can't imagine democracy itself endangered, freedom's survival genuinely questioned. But that time existed. June 1942. The free world's fate rested on a few hundred pilots from 3 carriers in the middle of the Pacific. And they were enough. Against impossible odds, against logic, they were enough. They stopped the most powerful carrier force ever assembled, destroyed it in 5 minutes, changed the war's course, saved freedom when it hung by a thread. The men who fought at Midway, American and Japanese, deserve remembrance as human beings who gave their lives serving their countries. American pilots flying to death to protect freedom, Japanese sailors dying, trying to save burning ships. All brave men who deserved better than dying young in the Pacific's middle. But their sacrifice wasn't in vain. Freedom survived, flourished. The Pacific, once a battlefield, became peaceful. Japan and America, bitter enemies, became close allies. The war that seemed endless ended 79 years ago. Soon, no one will remain who can say they were there, who saw Kaga explode, who watched Akagi burn, who dove through flak walls, who survived when so many didn't. But the story endures, must endure, because people who value freedom need to know freedom isn't free. It's purchased with blood of men who climbed into obsolete torpedo planes and flew to certain death, who dove through anti-aircraft fire, who gave everything to stop tyranny. That's what Midway did. Stopped tyranny, saved freedom, changed history. In 5 world-altering minutes on a clear June morning in 1942, when the world's fate balanced on a knife's edge and American pilots tipped the scales toward freedom, when ordinary men in extraordinary circumstances rose to meet the moment, when democracy proved it could produce warriors brave enough, skilled enough, determined enough to defeat the most powerful carrier force ever assembled. 5 minutes. That's all it took to change the world. Norman Kleiss stood on Enterprise's flight deck that June morning watching dive bombers warm up. He climbed into his Dauntless, started the engine, launched into uncertainty, found the enemy, dove through fire, hit his target. Survived when many didn't. He carried that memory for 74 years. Understood, even as a centenarian reflecting on a life fully lived, that those 5 minutes in 1942 had defined not just his life, but the course of history. The Pacific rolls on, unchanged by human affairs. The carriers rest in depths where no light reaches. The men who fought are passing into history. But what they did endures. The example they set remains. The lesson they taught, that freedom defended by free men is the most powerful force on earth, echoes across decades and will echo across centuries. That is Midway. That is what it means. That is why we remember.